Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Berta Barquero from the University of Barcelona, and with Eleonora Barelli from the University of Bologna, we will present part of this symposium that discusses the design of a teacher education proposal for interdisciplinarity, and we will present the design of a module about modeling the coronavirus evolution. We do it in name of the rest of the team: Oscar Romero, Maria Rosa Aguada, Joaquín Jiménez, Carolina Pipitone, and Gemma Sala Sebastián from the University of Barcelona. Nowadays, we are in front of a shared agreement shared by many researchers in science and in mathematics education, and supported by several curricular reforms and orientations that have recently been introduced in our educational systems, as it can be the inquiry-based approaches or the STEM approaches. But there is no doubt either about the important constraints that exist for interdisciplinarity and this interaction among the disciplines in a school. For example, the prevalence of monodisciplinary curricula, the disciplinary fragmentation that exists in schools, the time restrictions that exist for the teaching of official subjects, or the lack of new epistemologies in school for interdisciplinarity. But we have many examples of major issues, major questions in society, such as the understanding of the climate change or the impact of new energies, or, as it will be in our case, the understanding of the evolution of epidemics that require a collective effort by different disciplines working in interdisciplinary groups. These questions, calling for interdisciplinarity, are good opportunities for opportunities for interdisciplinary research and opportunities for teacher education to approach interdisciplinarity, to build tools with them, to move towards a new school paradigm that reflect on and make teachers progress on adopting and using tools to be able to question the disciplines, the disciplinary knowledge, the disciplinary boundaries, the synergies that can be established among the disciplines, and to address interdisciplinarity and what we mean by building up this new culture for interdisciplinarity. One of these major questions that call for interdisciplinary at the service of the society is the one that we will focus on, the one on understanding the evolution of the COVID-19 and the interaction established by a virus that arrived totally new for us, the questions that society raise, and how scientific disciplines interact to give responses to society. Then the particular research questions that we want to address is, in some sense, how to transpose the dynamics that we can see in scientific disciplines interacting with society to give response to the evolution of the pandemic toward teacher education and secondary school. In particular, our questions are: which questions related to interdisciplinarity might be addressed through teacher education, and which new epistemological and linguistic tools are necessary for teachers to then be able to transpose these interdisciplinary practices in secondary school education. If we focus in our research, the main theoretical frameworks and tools that we will use to address the research questions are in two levels. The first is the general methodology that we follow for the design of a teacher education proposals that are based on the proposal of the study and research path for teacher education, as proposed in the framework of the ATD, the anthropological theory of the didactic. The second level, tools to be shared with teachers to analyze disciplines and the interaction between the disciplines. We use the taxonomy about interdisciplinarity and the boundary object and the boundary crossing mechanisms. Here you have the submodel structure that we follow for the design of the teacher education proposal. It is an adaptation of the submodel structure of the study and research path for teacher education, but here adapted to address the issues about interdisciplinarity that we have mentioned. For the design of the particular model that we will focus in this presentation about modeling coronavirus evolution. In submodule 1, students are asked to adopt the role of interdisciplinarity explorers. It's when we will make explicit with participants the initial question related to interdisciplinarity on the selected topic that we have chosen. In submodule 2, we will ask students to adopt a new role and experience interdisciplinarity on their own shoes. It's when participants will have to experience one adaptation of a teaching proposals that we have prepared for them. In Submodule 3, they are asked to change of role and to become interdisciplinarity analysts, and they are asked to collectively analyze the teaching proposals. It's when we will introduce some tools for the epistemological analysis, the linguistic analysis, among others, about interdisciplinarity. And finally, in Submodule 4, they are asked to change of role and to become interdisciplinarity designers and teachers. It's when they will have one immersion in secondary school practices related to the activity previously developed. It's important to mention that the activities and going through the different submodule is not independent. To go to Submodule 3, for example, it's important to have the previous experience in Submodule 2 and 1, as well as when you are in the more complicated Submodule 4. You need all the experience in the previous submodules to be able to be there. Moreover, our intention is to ask participants to move around all the submodules, to build and to share a very rich milieu, to question and to analyze interdisciplinarity. We have different strategies that in the following slides we will talk about.
After having presented the general structure of the module, we now go deeper in detail with the first submodule. Here we start from a professional question related to interdisciplinarity in the scientific practices and their condition for transposition in school settings. This theme is indeed central during the entire module. Participants are here asked to become interdisciplinary explorers, discussing different questions. For example, the first question is: how have the STEM disciplines interacted to investigate the evolution of COVID-19? What answers have been given and how have their advances been spread to society? What role has each discipline played and how can we analyze interdisciplinarity issues when addressing complex themes related to the evolution of COVID-19? And finally, how can this interdisciplinary practice be transposed and disseminated into secondary schools? More concretely, the activity that we have proposed to students is an analysis of a selection of news about the scientific contribution to the understanding of COVID-19 evolution throughout the last 1 year and a half. We, as designers, have selected a set of news and research dissemination papers that the students have to analyze according to a specific guide. The guide that supported the analysis of the news by the students consisted in different questions. First of all, we wanted to ask the students what was the main questions that the research community has been addressing, and specifically which questions were addressed in the piece of news they were analyzing. Then a question on the disciplines that were present in the piece of news read and which can be detected and which have contributed to the discussion at stake. Then a question about the tools and disciplinary knowledge that can be detected in the piece of news and the specific terminology. About the specific terminology used in the news, we also asked if it was already in use in the scientific community and to the general public, or if it was new and typical of the pandemic. A digital board was used by the students to collect the answers to this guide. From the students' answers, we noticed that there were more open questions raised by the news than answers provided. And in particular, relating to the questions, we identified different types of questions. One type was the how many questions, so related to issues of quantity, of the numbers of the epidemics. Then there were what, how questions about issues of descriptions of the nature of the disease. Why questions about issues of explanation, like for example, why there is an exponential increase of the curve and something like that, and what to do questions related to methods for making decisions. And we also realized that most of these questions were very difficult to be addressed by only one discipline because required interaction among several of them. It was very important from the beginning for the students to reach an agreement on how discipline can be defined, so in terms also of its boundary, and it emerged a predominance of a rich terminology involving, for example, the data, the models and the role, and the issue of prediction. Starting from the results and the discussion on the analysis of the news, we now move to the second submodule. In this part of the module, the students experienced the so-called lines of interdisciplinary inquiry. They were divided in 3 groups, each of them studying a different line. The first was most related to data. In fact, it was about the delimitation of the system to look at and formulate hypotheses on the evolution of the pandemic. The second line of interdisciplinary inquiry was more about the models and the role of, in particular, of mathematical models to approach the evolution of the pandemic, while the third one regarded simulations, agent-based simulations in particular, and how to simulate scenarios to make decisions on social restrictions.
When we move to submodule 3, when the participants are asked to become interdisciplinarity analysts, the main instruments that we transfer to them to assume this role of analyst are, on the one hand, the maps of question and answers to sketch the dialectics that exist between the questions that they have addressed and the answers that they have provided. Also, they are then the participants are mixing groups, and they are presented to the second guide of analysis for interdisciplinarity, where they are asked to, thanks to this map of question and answers, also to detect the boundary objects and to describe the boundary crossing mechanisms in the activity that they come to experience. Here in particular, you have one example of a question and answer map elaborated by the student in an international summer school in 2021, where you can see in orange, blue, and green respectively the question and answer map that students elaborated for the first, second, and third line of interdisciplinarity inquiry. In particular, through this tool, they could sketch the dialectics between the question that they address and the answers that they obtained, but also a dynamic tool that describes the disciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge at stake. Here, if we zoom in the second line of interdisciplinarity, we detect also new uses of the question and answer map, a tool to detect intersections among other lines of inquiry, but also very useful tools to detect possible boundary objects that could be questions that they detected, answers that also they describe, or terminology or methods that they detect that are in the boundaries of the different disciplines, and also give rise to some kind of meta-reflections questions about interdisciplinarity. For example, here, the ones that you can read here in the bottom about, do models mean different things for the different disciplines? Or can we consider models as boundary objects?
From the last implementation in the International Summer School last June, we had examples of boundary objects recognized by the students throughout the module. In particular, one interdisciplinary boundary object recognized by them were the computational simulations. In fact, they say that to create the simulation, the medicine sets the parameters, math is needed to set the algorithms and the equations, computer science when we need to program and create an application, social discipline needed to analyze the results, and physics to set the scientific method. Another boundary object were data, where the government, so social science and political science, provide data, computer scientists compute them, math can read, and physicists explain. But many things were interpreted as boundary objects because some groups interpreted things related to measurement, to methods, techniques. Questions were interpreted as boundary objects, answers, tools, and phenomena. So a big variety of objects that can be boundary. We can say that some students identify disciplinary boundaries in a very naive way. For example, we have read that computer science is the science that provides us an applet, and physics is the science that generically sets the scientific method. And this finding seems to be more present when the students do not go deep in the analysis of specific conceptual tools, but remain on a higher order level of discussion. So we have found that we need to introduce specific moments of instruction in which an agreement on the disciplinary identities is reached among instructors and participants. However, most students were aware of the change in their understanding of boundary object that experienced throughout the module, arriving also to sentences like, at the beginning, this concept had different meaning depending of the background of each participant. But during the discussion, this meaning was mixed and the meaning was negotiated, leading to a final understanding.
And to finish, some conclusions about the progress that we detect with teachers in training on analyzing interdisciplinarity. The first is that when we start with the sub-modules, they had an absence of coherent notions, concepts, discourses, tools to talk about interdisciplinarity. But with our first analysis, we think that this change of roles, asking them to become explorers, students, analysts, designers, teachers, seems to facilitate a lot and to share a rich milieu with teacher in training and educators to analyze interdisciplinarity. On the other hand, introducing specific tools for the epistemological description of disciplinary and interdisciplinarity knowledge seems to be very fruitful, as they can be the use of question and answer maps, and also the progression that we ask with the guides of interdisciplinarity analysis. That seems a fruitful device to make this questioning evolve. Thanks a lot for your attention. Moltes gràcies. Grazie mille. Muito obrigados.